下面，请允许我介绍第3位演讲嘉宾 Rishi Bommasani 博士。Rishi Bommasani，斯坦福大学基础模型研究中心社会事务负责人，专注于基础模型的社会与经济影响研究，致力于推动基于实证的 AI 政策制定。曾担任加州前沿人工智能政策报告首席作者。欧盟通用型人工智能行为准则起草副主席，以及人工智能安全国际科学报告作者。Dr. Rishi, thank you for being with us. I'll pass the floor to you.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here, and today I will talk about some of the recent work we have been doing in California. So much in the spirit of what Marcus just talked about, I have been very interested in how we can bridge the gap between scientific expertise and policy in the AI domain. In particular, what I'll tell you about is how we have been doing this in California. And the first question I want to raise is, why should you care about what's happening in California? Well, first, there's the obvious reasons we all know, which is that California is a home of innovation in the United States and around the world. But the point I wanted to highlight is perhaps one that some of you may not know, which is that California is also the site of major regulatory attention at the state level within the United States. And so especially under the conditions where federal legislation and policy may be difficult, California has often played this role. So a concrete instance of that you can see is in the context of privacy. So there is no analog in the US of, say, GDPR like there is in the EU, but California at the state level does have a digital privacy law. And we have seen this play out more recently in the AI context with a number of pieces of legislation passing in California this past legislative cycle. So 17 bills were put into law. So the report I want to tell you about is in particular a response to one of those bills that came out of California last year. So this is a bill, SB 1047, that was proposed in the legislature last year. And it moved through the legislature and then ultimately was vetoed by California's Governor Gavin Newsom. So this bill covered sort of safety in various senses for frontier AI, many of the similar kinds of models that Marcus was just talking about. And in particular, in response to that bill, the governor of California created a working group, and what I'll tell you about is the report that this working group has produced. So it includes Don Song, who spoke earlier today, and a number of others across Stanford, Berkeley, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So this report is a report that we developed over the course of about 9 months, releasing it in its final form last month. The report began with the authors, but then was sent out to a number of independent experts for feedback. Ultimately, we published the first version of the report and then solicited broader public feedback. And then we received a significant feedback to which we ultimately arrived at the final version of the report, which is what I'm about to tell you about. So the report covers a series of topics, the first of which is how we can learn from evidence in the form of history. So of course, many of the developments we are seeing with frontier AI are things that are happening in real time, and so it's important that we draw upon history. There are 3 lessons I want to highlight from this report. So the first is about how the early decisions we make in any particular domain are particularly formative for how that domain proceeds. So a concrete instance of that we can learn from the history of the internet is in the early days of the internet, so in the 90s, for example, we saw some of the first evidence of cybercrime and cyber attacks with the Morris worm. Ultimately, we didn't have any significant policy response at that time, and therefore, as a result, now 30 years later, we continue to see significant cybercrime estimated somewhere between 1% to 4% of the GDP. The second is on the value of transparency in the governance of technologies and other products. So in particular, in the case of tobacco, in the 50s, we saw significant evidence about the relationship between tobacco and smoking and harm and disease. including cancer. But what was done at that time in response was to have fairly minimal transparency. So a single line was required to be added to cigarettes and other tobacco-based products. Ultimately, it would take multiple decades thereafter to see a larger public response after far deeper transparency was required into the harms of tobacco. The final piece here, which goes to something Yashua mentioned this morning, is the importance of acknowledging expertise of industry, but also having mechanisms for its independent verification. So in particular, in the 60s, in climate, we began to accumulate some evidence within leading companies in the energy space on the impacts of this industry on climate. But this work ultimately did not really materialize in the public eye until multiple decades later, and the mechanisms for external parties to verify it really did not come about until much later. So that was what we wanted to draw upon historically. Now, the frame of the report is to really think about what evidence-based policy would look like in the AI domain. And one of the key insights, again, building on Yasha's report that we heard about this morning, is that policymakers face an evidence dilemma. That is, there might be cost to acting early, given the incomplete evidence we might have today, but there may also be costs of acting too late, especially given some of the severity of the types of harms we are talking about. So with that in mind, the key idea this report tries to advance is how can policy actively catalyze the generation of new evidence? And so what I want to tell you about is 4 mechanisms we go through in the report for doing this in particular. So the first is on disclosure from frontier AI companies to the government, but especially to the public. The reason we focus on public-facing disclosure is that many of the broader stakeholders who might act on the information might not be siloed within governments. And we in particular highlight some areas where past research has identified systemic opacity in the AI industry at present. The second topic we talk about is whistleblower protections. So there are in the United States a variety of whistleblower protections that employees in the private sector may be eligible for. Notably, these protections currently do not cover, in most cases, actions by the company that are themselves not illegal, right? So in the AI space, given that there is very little existing regulation that makes certain things illegal in relation to AI, the resultant whistleblower protections, or protections for employees trying to identify things happening within companies, might themselves also be limited. And this is what we highlight in the report. The third is a theme we've heard throughout today about the value of third-party risk assessment. Here, the specific thing I want to highlight is current barriers that are preventing third-party risk assessment. So in particular, many of the leading frontier AI companies and AI companies more generally have policies in terms of service when you use their tools that by design are trying to limit the malicious use of these tools. But this may also mean that good faith AI researchers trying to identify vulnerabilities and the like may also be violating these terms of service and therefore be susceptible to legal action. And so we talk about how there could be safe harbors. So by analogy, in the US, about 20 years ago in cybersecurity, we developed similar safe harbors to protect researchers trying to identify cyber vulnerabilities. And the final point is related to the incident reporting topic Marcus just mentioned. So here we talk about incident reporting or adverse event reporting. So many of the mechanisms we discuss in AI safety are really about thinking about how we can understand the technology prior to its deployment. But it's equally important when we deploy these general purpose technologies to see what we can do after its deployment. And so in particular, how can we accumulate the evidence base of adverse events and incidents? And so here we draw upon some of the work in other domains where adverse event reporting has been done, such as in the domain of vaccines, aviation, and transportation. The final topic I want to highlight is a topic that any jurisdiction will encounter in trying to contemplate policy, which is the topic of scoping. That is, which entities are and are not in scope of the policy. So in many domains, the approach we have seen in many jurisdictions, that is to use compute. So as Marcus mentioned, some very compute-intensive models might be in scope of the EU AI Act's GPI with systemic risk categorization. What we wanted to look at is alternatives, in addition to compute, as ways of distinguishing which entities may and may not fall in scope of a policy. And we arrived at a principle which I want to highlight here, which is that when possible, designing a policy so that the threshold, the criterion by which entities are in scope, matches the actual objectives of the policy, having alignment between those two elements of the policy is particularly useful. So with that, I want to wrap up and again highlight sort of 3 top-level things I'd like you to take away from this presentation. So the first is that California is an important jurisdiction to pay attention to, not merely because of its importance in the innovation ecosystem in the United States, but also because of its role in the regulatory ecosystem in the United States. In particular, what we have done in this report and what we'll see in the coming few months in the legislative calendar at the state level in the US is developments where this report is posed to really try to bridge the gap between scientific evidence and policy making in real time in the US and in California. And the key idea I want to drive home is that policymakers are often facing this challenge where this technology is moving rapidly, and there is a lot we might like to know about this technology that would inform the decisions we make. With that in mind, a key idea here is that policy need not passively wait for evidence to accumulate and wait for other parties to figure that out, but rather create the conditions and incentives to actively drive its generation to ultimately inform future, more substantive policy. So with that, thank you. I'm very excited for the rest of this event.
Thank you, Dr. Rishi.